I think whether it's counterfactuals or some of the different strategies that have been employed here, I wonder if it's worth sort of talking about our responsibility to talk beyond people like the people in this group. You know, if Atlantic history is to actually mean something, if it's to have a kind of catch in a kind of broader imagination, that means speaking to people outside of academia, and it seems to me that narrative in all of its kind of different forms is sort of the way of doing that. And the way I've found that my work sort of connects most obviously to people in other disciplines and to kind of people outside of who don't necessarily do what we do. And then I might just sort of say something I probably sort of shouldn't say. I've done a conference on narrative before, and I found myself kind of struggling in some ways to sort of participate in the conversation, in the sense that I had a hard time formulating what I thought about narrative, which probably isn't just my problem, but I certainly felt it in both cases. And I realized, I think during this meeting, that it's because even though I'm really hard on Longfellow, fundamentally I kind of am Longfellow, in that I have a very romantic sensibility about my own connection in a kind of personal and almost spiritual way to the people that I'm writing about. Just to make that a little more concrete, I once wrote something, I found a document through kind of a massive sort of series of archival inquiries that involved a dead priest and a double-wide trailer in Nova Scotia. It's just, it itself is kind of a great story. But I found myself in some colonial archives in Connecticut, read about a document I don't think anybody's ever worked on, about a couple of these Acadian guys that I write about. Two families, 3 and 4 children each. Parents get separated from the children in 1755. Parents get sent to Maryland. Kids, 7 of them, get sent to Connecticut with their grandfather. They're sent to Woodbury, Connecticut, where, you know, kind of the selectman of the town where they get sent to sends them out to be apprenticed to joiners and so forth and so on. And these kids spend about 18 months in Connecticut. They get acclimated to going to school, kind of working for these people. And then about 18 months later, their parents, who are emaciated, stagger into Woodbury in the middle of winter. They're wearing rags, they have vermin all over them, and they find their kids and they clutch them kind of to their sort of wrecked bodies and all this stuff. It turns out the kids are horrified by this, and they don't want to go back with their parents because they don't recognize them, they don't understand them, they're revolted by them, they're frightened of them. And you know, while I was writing this, I have kids, and so I couldn't help but thinking, you know, what would happen to my own children if my wife and I were to go away, were to disappear, and were to come back kind of radically transformed? What kind of decisions would they make? And I really struggled to write that part of my book manuscript. And the point is that there's something kind of undefinable and almost undiscussable about our connection with narrative as historians or people who study literature. And whatever it is, though, that we sort of find, I think it's sort of imperative to tell those stories, to reveal those stories, and to illuminate sort of the connections between places and people that weren't necessarily made. And like I say, I've always had a hard time sort of talking about that, and I suppose it's for that reason. It's that I do have this romantic sensibility about what a narrative is. And I guess we all have a kind of set of kind of rules about narrative that we have to choose from. And I suppose it's worthwhile talking about why we make the decisions we make in constructing our own narratives.
I mean, I think we could draw lessons from, since my appointment is half in literature and now half in history, to my own surprise sometimes. I think that if we think about narrative in contemporary literary contexts, in colonized contexts, those European colonies, to clarify that, I mean, narrative supplements where archive fails. So several of the papers have been on nostalgia in the archive, like Chris's, or where archives seem to indicate a trace but not a full presence, let's say female subjectivity, like the trial narratives. And you know, we have innumerable examples in contemporary literature, from Derek Walcott to Jamaica Kincaid and onward, where those little traces to Jim could say in the South African context, you know, Waiting for the Barbarians, brilliantly plays on the idea of an archive that's sort of readable in the sands, but not fully, to make up a fake story for this tribal woman when he's being interrogated, for example. And it's exactly the same question that we're dealing at, except as someone who's who's really trained in literature and now is in a history department, I find there's a kind of a movement to the same overlapping point from what some creative writers do, maybe more effectively than we do in terms of reaching a larger audience, and what some historians do. I mean, Amitav Ghosh, in one of his early pieces, later put in Subaltern Studies, traced the figure of Ben Yiju, who was the slave, and he was in some manuscript in the Geniza in Cairo, and he used this to reconnect a whole kind of lost history of the Indian Ocean that linked up coastal Africa and the western coasts of India. He was doing it as both a writer and a trained anthropologist, but that was the aim, is to put together the narrative of this lost figure. So I think some of what we're doing in our various projects, both as historians and people in literature departments, is supplementing a partial archive with that. And that's where also the danger enters. So.
Just to jump in on that one point, because I think, Chris, your comment made so much sense to me. I think one academic who does exactly the kind of thing you're calling for and that you just pointed to is Saidiya Hartman in that book, Lose Your Mother, about kind of sort of personal meditation initiated precisely by a partial or non-existent archive that makes very explicit those sort of investments. So.
What was the first thing you said to be, I missed, you said what it calls, you were turned that way, so I couldn't hear it to be,
sorry.
To be something for the archive?
That book, Lose Your Mother, it's very much driven by a non-existent archive or a portion of it. And filling in with.
It's not only that we are supplementing the archive. I think it's important to notice that they were supplementing the archive. No? So as Lisa was explaining about the Historia Imperial de Potosí, no? Well, that history, that particular history is also to a certain extent, and you don't know exactly what, a fabrication. No? So he's inserting things that are history, some others that are fiction, that are false according to standard history, no? But and that is something that I think you see a lot in the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th century, no? So not only in the Historia Imperial de Potosí, in the narratives, in the captive narratives, no? So it's not exactly they are in part an archive. No? So they have the history. They can be considered construed as documents, no? But at the same time, the connection with fiction is almost inevitable. No? So the question of history and memory finally blends. No? Instead of saying, okay, there is a history and then it's a memory. No? So the interplay between both are much more messy, if you want to say that. No? So they cross much more than sometimes I think we are willing to accept.
Well, yeah. I think it's just interesting how narrative is something that we as some literary scholars and historians, or some that are both, are drawn to in slightly different ways, and I wonder if it can illuminate anything about the trade gap that Chris referred to in Eric Slaughter's great article. And I'd just like to, while it seems that a lot of the historians have focused on an absence of narratives and constructing our narratives and how we do that, I think at least we were looking at the narratives that exist and how do we read them. And I just sort of like to make put this forward as a sort of, maybe that's what historians can read literary scholars for, because we're kind of trained in reading narratives, and we have to not only supplement those narratives, but read, as Jose was saying, the narratives that are there, because there are a lot.
But I don't think that archives can ever be taken as unmediated bodies. I know you're not suggesting that, but I think that we want to add to this discussion of the archive the idea that archives already encode a variety of things. Power relations, obviously. So once one has a text, as you were saying, it just doesn't solve the problem. It's in fact the beginning of the problem. And then the question is how to pose the right questions of that archive. And I just wanted to say that now maybe, I don't know if we're allowed to talk the particularities of the papers, but for example, with Chris's paper, I was curious to hear more about the nostalgia that you referred to in there based on, which was effectively the planter class in exile, because you mentioned the Philadelphia, and I put up that image by Anne-Louis Giraudet of Bellay and all that, but there's a story, I think maybe Laurent Dubois recounts it, or maybe Darcy Grigsby, who has a kind of great reading of this painting. She's an art historian. And she mentions that Bellay, when he went to speak in Paris, he went via Philadelphia. And he had to go underground because he was attacked by the emigre exile planter classes hanging out in Philadelphia. And he had to go underground, and it was only until he got to New York that he made it to Paris. Otherwise, he was almost a dead man. So, I mean, what I wanted to hear was, although that is a very, the accounts are full of nostalgia, to me, there is also, there's a politics to that nostalgia. So I wanted to hear more. You didn't get to the politics of nostalgia, but that's one example of how an archive already encodes a whole structure of feeling, Raymond Williams might have said, or discourses of power, as Michel might have said.